Hi everyone, welcome to the Carroll School Speaker Series. I'm here tonight with Jen Amos and Gwendolyn Meredith, who are our speech and language pathologists at the lower school and middle school, respectively. They are super excited to talk to you all tonight about executive functions and Carroll. We're going to go more in depth on the relationship between attention, working memory, executive function, and language. Just going through some housekeeping for this evening. The presentation should take about an hour, give or take. If you have questions, we are hoping that you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We're going to enable chat just at the beginning for sort of a quick activity, but then turn it off. So should you have questions, again, use that Q&A button. And if there's time at the end, we're going to sort of field some of these questions to Jen and Gwendolyn. If not, we will be sure to get to everyone on email after. We do have the capability of logging all the questions and then responding. And it is possible that Jen and Gwendolyn, they've been super thorough in this presentation, may even answer your question in the context of the presentation. So just going ahead one slide, we're going to do a little activity that involves you using the chat. And if you could just take a moment to use the chat feature and let us know what you know about executive functions. Let's see, and Jen Brock, I just want to make sure that all participants have access to the chat. Is that the case?
Yes, that is the case.
Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much. So planning, organizing, ability to self-organize, more about planning, organization, something that kids need to get to school every day, decision-making, all really good comments, really, really good comments. Focus, yes. Understanding context, things we can use in everyday life. Really, really good. Something I'm actually using right now as I monitor the chat and try and talk to you. And I'm just going to take another minute here. Ability to deal with situations that may be stressful. So again, if you're just joining us, we have quite a large group. I'm here with Jen Amos and Gwendolyn Meredith, who are speech and language pathologists at the lower school and middle school, though we will also be touching upon the upper school program if you happen to have a child in that program as well. For this evening, if you have questions, if you could use the Q&A button, and we're going to attempt to address your questions either here tonight or later on email. One thing to note is we will be recording tonight's presentation. So should there be someone in your family, neighborhood, a friend who wants to see it, there will be a link available coming out in the next couple days to a week or so. So without too much hesitation, too much more kind of tap dancing to let everyone get in, I'm going to pass this over to my colleague, Jen Amos. Thanks so much.
Hello. All right. I'm hoping I'm now visible and unmuted for everybody. So I'm here with Gwendolyn, who you can't see yet, but you'll see as soon as she starts talking, to talk about executive function language and Carroll, which we're really excited about. And your answers were all spot on in the chat, so stay tuned. All right, so just to kind of give you a framework with where we're going to be going tonight, we will start off sort of talking about executive function sort of across the Carroll span. What does that look like trajectory-wise? Executive functions and language development and how those are connected and why we as the speech language pathologists are the ones who are talking to you about executive function. And then we're sort of going to focus on some main areas of executive functions. So those being attention, working memory, organization, and then self-monitoring, goal setting, goal management, and the planning that goes into all of that. So to sort of start us off, we like to start with this statement from our We Believe statements, which are part of our mission at Carroll. You can find them all on our website, but this is what we call our GEC statement. If you've all heard us talking about GEC before, that's our give each child what they most need. And we bring this up because when we're thinking about executive function at Carroll, that's something that many of our students are working on and need some support with. So GEC for our students means that we're going to talk about broad strokes about how we understand what students need, what sort of scaffolds are built in, how it's part of our curricula, how we're moving through our day, supporting executive function on a broad scale. But also this GEC piece is knowing how we're going to modify that for each individual student, given sort of everything they're bringing to the table to see what they need to be able to thrive in their classroom.
All right, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Jen. So my name is Gwen Meredith. I'm actually the 8th grade SLP. I am very fortunate to collaborate with some fabulous SLPs in 6th grade with Samantha LaRochelle and Eileen Anderson in 7th grade. So together as the speech team, we support language and executive functioning throughout the Carroll time. So I appreciated all the fabulous chats. I especially love about how sometimes as adults, we have challenges with executive functioning. So deciding what to make for dinner is pretty hard. And executive functioning definitely plays into that. So in a broad umbrella stroke, executive functioning or executive functions are the set of cognitive skills that allow us to plan tasks, self-regulate, organize our time and materials, and complete goals. So there's tons of different individual pieces, from response inhibition, shifting your attention, initiating a task, planning and prioritizing, sequencing the steps of a task, monitoring yourself as you're working, managing your time and estimating how long each step will take, identifying goals, breaking those goals down, and then the metacognitive piece, which we are going to talk about. So our big theme this year is, what is the relationship between executive functioning and language, and why are the speech and language pathologists talking to you about executive functioning skills? So the big takeaway is that executive functions and language have a bi-directional developmental relationship, which if we break it down with morphology, bi, it's that too. So there's 2 directions in this developmental relationship. So as the executive functions begin to develop within the frontal lobe, I think you got to click, we got some animations going. I'm just getting Jen all set. Yep, there we go. So as the executive functions begin to develop within the frontal lobe, the language processes are also starting to develop. And the executive functions support that language development because the executive functions help sequence parts of a story, inhibit impulsive responses and interjections in conversations. They might help shifting conversation topics easily. You utilize your working memory all throughout language, but especially when you're following directions and tasks. And you also use your self-monitoring for comprehension and making sure you're staying on topic. On the other hand, though, language also supports your executive functioning development. So in order to plan and organize and sequence and prioritize, you need sequencing words, you need conjunctions, you need semantic features and verbs that are essential for multi-step plans. And we will get into all of those specifically later on. Verbal reasoning skills allow students to categorize materials and make inferences about what the expectations are, and also predict possible outcomes. So for many of our students, executive functions and language are bolstering each other up as they develop throughout their life. Oh yeah, we just have some happy little arrows to remind you it's a cyclical, bi-directional relationship. So the big theme that we work on as speech pathologists is self-talk, which is essential for planning, predicting, setting goals, inhibiting self-monitoring reasoning. It really is the metacognition, where you're thinking about your thinking. We use this inner dialogue to support our understanding of the task, the problem, or the goal. We have to predict how we might solve it. We might use language to brainstorm steps. Our inner dialogue and self-talk helps us reflect on our process, helps us identify when we need to shift, what we need to inhibit. what we need to do to regulate ourselves. So all of these metacognitive skills are really complex processes that are supported by both executive functioning and language. And in the next slide, yes, fabulous, Jen. So I do just want to touch on that executive functions are a developmental phase that begin in early childhood and continue to develop throughout late teens and early 20s. Typically, we think that they tend to develop until about 25 years old when the frontal lobe has finally finished developing. So there's plenty of time for all of our middle schoolers and even upper school kids to continue developing their executive functioning skills. I have a quick breakdown for you just to show where your child might be in a traditional executive functioning path. So many of my students are working on increasing their working memory capacity, working on cognitive flexibility, so being able to think about something in new and unique ways, trying to organize and plan complex tasks themselves, and thinking about like decision making and selecting goals for their tasks. Well, most of Gen kids might be working on following a few step directions and understanding the knowledge of rules and beginning to perform self-talk. So a big part of what we do is making sure that all of the work that we're working on is developmentally appropriate for our children. And in the next slide, we have some gradual release information for you all.
Sorry, I was muting and unmuting myself instead of changing the slide. So the other sort of theme that we're going to have running through all of this, and that I think it's really important to think about when you're thinking about a child's, trajectory through their academic programming, trajectory through their year, through any given skill or activity, is this idea of a gradual release model. And then we're going to show you sort of what that modeling can look like visually in a second. But what the idea of that is that you're really purposefully moving through what the task looks like to keep a child in what can be referred to as the zone of proximal development. And what we mean by that is you can consider it kind of like the Goldilocks zone of pushing the child just far enough that they're working sort of as hard as they can to try to learn something new, and they're challenged and they're working at their highest capacity without challenging them so much that it's inaccessible to them. And that's sort of like the Orton-Gillingham phrase we use a lot that kind of parallels that, is that we're trying to move students through a task, curriculum, Orton-Gillingham, whatever it might be, as fast as they can go, but as slow as we need to go. So that's the idea of this gradual release model and this zone of proximal development, is that we're going to move as fast as we can through kind of moving them towards more independence, but we're going to go as slow as we need to and make sure we're never pushing them faster than they're able to go. This is sort of what that like modeling can look like visually, where you're starting from complete teacher modeling and you're taking some joint responsibility that can look like more teacher responsibility and a little bit of student, all the way down to barely teacher responsibility, mostly student, and the goal being student can do it independently. We talk about this a lot at Carroll in terms of an academic skill. So if you're thinking about something like being able to highlight the main idea of something that you've read, that might look at the beginning like a teacher is doing it on the board and they're demonstrating their self-talking out loud, what their thinking processes are, how they got there, and they're modeling doing the underlining. And then maybe the teacher's still going to do all of the modeling themselves, but the kids have a paper in front of them that they can track on and they can underline with them. Then they're starting to have group brainstorms about what the main idea might be and do it as a group, all the way down. We're going to step by step it back until they're able to do it independently. We have this sort of just as an example of like, what do we mean when we say across the Carroll span, there's also a gradual release? So if you think about something like a homework planner, which we put a lot of thought into at Carroll, we know homework can be tricky. There's sort of two things that are happening. Within the course of a year, we expect students to get more independence with their use of their homework planner. But also, as you look developmentally across sort of their time in BR2 through 8th or 9th grade at Carroll, there's also going to be a developmental trajectory there where we're expecting them to take more independence of their ability to organize and keep track of and manage their work. So if we're looking at something like our BR2 homework planner or our 3rd grade homework log, that often will look at like pretty much we're just trying to build the routine of there's a homework that goes back and forth that you have to complete. And the students are really doing the work of making sure it happens every day, but the parents are bearing the brunt of the load of doing the homework with them. It's a lot of joint reading in those early grades. Then it might start to break down into being more, I might have language homework and math homework, and I have to keep track of those things separately because I got them from a different teacher as we're moving into something like 5th grade. And then as we move into 6th, 7th, 8th in the upper school, it does start to look a lot more like a traditional homework planner, and a lot more of the responsibility for keeping that done or getting that done is going to be on the student as opposed to the teacher. So this middle school planner is going to look very similar in 6th through 8th grade, but in 6th grade, it's going to look like they fill out their classes and have their planner checked, and then they can sort of earn the right to go without having a check. In 7th grade, their planners are sort of going to be checked as needed, and in 8th grade, they're expected to be more independent with it. Same thing in the upper school, we're going to look at a way to look at the different classes. How long is it going to take me to be able to do that? When is it due? How do I need to plan based off of that? What classes did I have today? What classes do I have tomorrow? And they're starting to build in more responsibility for managing all of those moving parts. And then the other thread that Gwendolyn mentioned that we're going to sort of talk through throughout the whole presentation is this idea of self-talk as a way that we can use our language skills to mediate our thinking to complete a task that uses our executive function skills. We can also think about that as following this gradual release model, where when we're teaching a skill like self-talk, that initially it's going to look like the teacher is taking all of the ownership of modeling the self-talk. And then maybe this teacher is going to do some modeling and direct students to do it themselves as well. Or the teacher will rehearse and then prompt the students like, what's your self-talk strategy going to look like? Then there might be some more subtle visual cues. There might be the teacher sort of contriving situations so there are lots of opportunities for self-talk, but not cueing it until hopefully they're doing something like that independently. Just as an aside to sort of frame where we're going, this thread of self-talk, we're going to talk through how that would follow through in sort of each of these domains of executive functioning that we're talking about tonight. So there is sort of a slide for each section where we're going to break down what would self-talk look like for a task that would be primarily a working memory task or an attention task or something like that.
All right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about attention next. And I do want to stipulate, while attention is not an executive function, it is something that correlates heavily and supports a lot of executive functioning skills. So I think it's really important to take some time to talk about attention and making sure that we're paying attention to these cognitive skills that actually modulate and support executive functioning skill development. So overall, attention sort of acts as this filter that will amplify prioritized information while decreasing non-essential sensory information. One of my professors used to call attention the foundational bedrock of cognition because it literally is filtering what comes up through your conscious cognition. So it filters out things that we don't even really are conscious of all the time, like how your socks feel on your feet or that weird fan that you're not really paying attention to in the back of the classroom. So it's filtering out all of these non-essential sensory pieces. It's often unconsciously prioritizing information that your attention's perceiving as relevant. However, through some training and practice and self-talk strategies, you can begin to identify and shift your attention and direct it more specifically. So there are some specific subtypes of attention. Sustained attention is the subtype that is the ability to prolong and focus on attention tasks for longer periods of time. When we think about attention, this is often the first thing you think of, like, oh, I can watch a 20-minute video and not get distracted. Or, oh my gosh, I can only like watch a few TikToks and then I'm totally distracted, is what some of my kids would say. Selective attention is the ability to focus in on one task and filter out other distractions, which we will be talking about later. And then alternating attention is the ability to efficiently switch between tasks. The key word being efficiently, meaning that you might be able to switch between tasks, but someone with challenges with an alternating attention might have a hard time with transitions between classes. And so it's important to note that students may have strengths or challenges in between one or more of these attention subtypes. So one way that alternating and shifting attention does kind of come up and support our oral language skills and conversations is that whenever we're talking to one another, we always need to perspective take and take time to listen to other people's opinions. And attention is really important because it's taking time to shift your attention away from your own personal thoughts and concerns to the personal viewpoints and perspectives of one or even more people. So if a student is having trouble paying attention to their friends or talking about their concerns, it might be difficult to follow a conversational thread. So attention is really important for a lot of these social, emotional, peer connections at this age. And the next slide is just sort of like some common external presentations of what it could look like if a child is struggling with attention. We often think about inattentive or hyperactive types of ADHD, which is a disorder that often impacts attention, or there's also combined types. So you might see some fidgeting, some restlessness, or difficulty sitting still. You might also see another kid who's sitting quietly and just staring off at nothing in particular and appearing to be focused, but might commonly ask questions like, wait, what? Because they're not really sure what's going on. So they might talk about how they were daydreaming, or you might have other students describe themselves as not having a filter and are commonly making impulsive comments or decisions. One thing I want to note about this is you see the language rush through tasks or make rash decisions. I do think it's important to make sure that you are always using inclusive language to describe these types of behaviors, because it's not a moral decision to rush through these tasks or make rash decisions. It's not that they're not choosing to think through them. It's just a neurological difference in the way that their brain's processing. And so it's important to note the way that we describe their behaviors. So in the next slide, so students with attention challenges are often more impacted by distractors. They're normally internal or external sensory information that can overwhelm the attention filter and redirect attention to them. So you might have a task or goal that you want to be focused on, but sensory information from the environment or even internal thoughts, feelings, and impulses can get in the way and redirect your attention away from that task. So important to note is that sensitivity to distractors might vary by day of the week, time of day, or classroom. It's important to notice also that this impulsivity is just a neurological difference in the way that their brain responds. And one thing that I love about working with these kids is it's also sometimes their superpower. So their brains are more sensitive to these stimuli, which means that sometimes they notice things that I would never in a million years pick up on. Like just today, I walked into my classroom that I've been teaching in all week and was kind of distracted trying to prep for this lesson I was working on. And one of my students who was practicing attention strategies noticed, hey, Miss Meredith, you got new desks in your classroom. I had no idea. I did not even register that as something within my environment that had totally changed. But he noticed it the moment he walked in the room, which is just one of those things to show that sometimes being more aware of your environment can actually be really good for our students. But some examples of distractors is there's auditory distractors with background noises that might be impacting their ability to focus, like fans or phone alerts or some unusual or unexpected noise. Sometimes visual distractors, like a preferred activity, like a cell phone within line of sight, or if there's just too much visual information coming on at one time. If they're physically discomforting with hot or cold temperatures, hunger, uncomfortable seating, or cognitive distractors, some internal thoughts, emotions, tiredness, anxiety, or social distractions is a big piece that I see in the middle school.
So one thing that we're going to have as a thread moving through is, so what do we do to support these things? Because many of our students struggle with these capacities as we move through our day at learning. So we've broken that down into what do some developmentally appropriate supports look like at the lower school, and then how might that look different at the middle and upper school. At the lower school, when we're thinking about attention, the biggest thing that our kids are really developmentally working on is understanding what it feels like to attend. I had a friend in graduate school who struggles with executive functioning once describe to me that the challenge with knowing if you've attended to something is that you are not aware that you're not attending when you're not attending to your inattention. So the biggest goal for our littlest kids is just building that awareness of, how do I know when I'm paying attention in school? How do I know if I'm doing what the teacher is expecting me to be doing, if I'm getting all the information that they're saying? What does it feel like when I'm a regulated, calm learner? And that can vary for our kids. That's where GET comes in. So for some kids, it's like, if I'm looking down and using a fidget, I am getting way more out of this lesson. And for some kids, that fidget makes it way harder, and a fidget is not a great choice for them. So it's helping them build that awareness of, what does it feel like when I'm attending, and what do I need to get to that place? There is some explicit teaching of those skills. All of our 1st through 4th graders have a class called community building that's heavily supported by counseling, which is really working on building awareness of, what does it feel like when I'm a regulated attending student, and what are strategies I can use if I'm not in a place. We use a lot of the zones of regulation, which we would call that the green zone, being ready to learn. So there's a lot of explicit teaching and practice with strategies that can help you notice if you're not in the green zone, and help you get what you need to be back in the green zone. There are also, like I mentioned, some individual supports. So those are some whole class strategies. On the individual level, students might have alternative seating, something like a wobble stool, some kind of a cushion on their seat. There are all kinds of things we can do with seating, fidgets, silent signals, flexible seating. Some students need to be at a stand-up desk or somewhere else in the classroom. So those are all kinds of ways we can customize as well.
All right, so in the middle and upper schools, we have a mixture of whole class strategies, which might be built-in brain breaks or movement breaks into just the daily curriculum and the way that teachers are creating their lesson plans. Many classrooms have space and times, which is a responsive classroom idea about having a space where students can go to refocus themselves while staying within the classroom and environment. We also have very structured transitions and routines, which we're going to talk about later, and why that supports attention. And we are always using repetition and rephrasing of directions. So if a child somehow misses a direction because they were not attending to the direction, then they will get a chance to hear it again. It's not that it's gone forever. I also often work with counseling too on some individual strategies and plans. As Jen mentioned, some kids love fidgets, other kids are very distracted by fidgets. So we work on an individual strategy basis. Some students use mindfulness-based journals to reflect on their attention and how it changes throughout the day. Some students prefer white noise to filter out some of those auditory distractors. The upper school often gives wobble stools for students who need a little bit of that motor kinesthetic regulation. We also have students self-reflect on their profile and have visual reminders of the self-talk strategies that we'll talk about in a moment. So some of those self-talk strategies for attention, just to give you a quick preview of what self-talk is. So these are sort of overlearned phrases that, as we explained earlier, the teacher would model and we'd be saying so many times that the kids like actually get annoyed with us, where I will always repeat to my students, wait, what are we working on? Wait, what are we working on? Wait, what are we working on? In a way that drives them wild. But it's important for them to internalize that language and dialogue, so that way they can begin to cue themselves when they notice that they are not attending. They have that language to cue themselves to think, wait, what should I be doing? What is the group doing around me? For students who are going through and trying to check for maybe impulsive mistakes on a math assignment after they complete it, we might have notice, focus, find it, fix it. We might have what is around me as a way to cue them to what they should be attending to in this time. So these are all strategies that would just guide the development of their attention and their ability to redirect themselves in that moment. So that just about wraps up attention. You can have 30 seconds, because we talked a lot about attention, to think about attention strategies at Carroll and how you can use them at home. And then afterwards, I'm going to talk to you about my favorite thing in the world, working memory, which again, this is not often brought in as an explicit executive function, but it does modulate executive functioning development and is so important for language, which is why I love it. So overall, working memory is, there it is. It's that mental workbench where information is stored for a short period of time to help complete a goal. And goal is a very important part of this because our working memory is using resources to help you complete that goal. So there are a couple different components of working memory. So there's basically, if you imagine, a couple different workbenches that your mind has access to. There's the phonological loop, which is where you're storing language and auditory information. There's the visual-spatial sketchpad, which is your workbench for visual information that you need to solve this problem. And then there's the episodic buffer, which is literally just like, what is the sensory information that you experienced just in this short period of time that's going to be related to your goal. This might be some quick directions or something that a friend said that might be related. Now, the central executive, which really is so important for executive functioning, is really, I like to think about it, if working memory is like a workbench where you're storing information, the central executive is the person grabbing the tools and deciding what to build. So the central executive identifies and prioritizes information to store within all of your workbenches, and it selects what information is important for that selected goal. So that central executive is so important. And when we think about the secretary of the brain, I often imagine that central executive aspect of the working memory. And it is so important because I always say working memory is pervasive. It's an important cognitive function that helps us complete almost any daily task, from cooking to crafting to even like just hanging out and talking with friends. So many activities of daily living and language comprehension, which we will see, are impacted by working memory. So this next slide is a little bit of how working memory relates to conversation and oral language. So this is just like if Jen and I are hanging out after the presentation talking. As I'm speaking, I need to remember the details and my main goal that I'm trying to express. I need to be able to reach back and think to all the different ideas I want to share. As I'm listening to Jen, I need to hold on to the details that Jen is sharing. So that way I'm able to recall all of the aspects of her interesting story that she's sharing. Then, as I'm thinking, the working memory helps me recall and sort through information that might be related to this conversation. So it is absolutely vital for oral language, especially because unlike written language, oral language processes through so quickly. So we heavily rely on our working memory for oral language discourse. But for written language, it's a little bit different. So just to break this down, there are really 3 levels that working memory supports written language. So if we're reading from the bottom up, they would start reading where they're storing the sounds and letters, where they're decoding within an individual word. This is especially true in Orton Gillingham for some of our early readers who are breaking apart and trying to identify all the individual sounds within a word. Then, after decoding the word, the working memory holds on to the words that were previously read within the sentence. And for lengthier connected text, it holds on and maintains the main ideas within the story or narrative that they're reading. It's the exact opposite for writing. As they are trying to write a paragraph or essay, they have this main end goal in mind that they have to maintain throughout the text. Then they have to hold on to the words that they are planning to write next within their sentence so they don't lose their train of thought halfway through. And then I often see as students are trying to sound out and spell, this working memory piece is absolutely vital for them with their visual spatial processing and phonological processing, helping them break down and recall all of the sounds and letter correspondence within those words. So this is why, as I said, I love working memory and think it is so important for many of our students. And we have some supports at the lower school.
So in terms of the lower school, the main goal for working memory supports is helping students be able to hold information on that workbench while they're processing it. That can look 2 different ways at the lower school. So there's the level of teacher strategies, which could also be parent strategies for you all at home, and then the strategies that the students themselves can use. From the teacher lens, the biggest thing we can do for our younger students is making sure we are chunking the information we're giving them into manageable parts. So thinking about, even if it was a simple direction, how many directions did I just give them at once? If I say to a student, can you grab your homework folder out of your backpack, a pencil, a clipboard, and meet me on the rug? They actually got 4 directions, not just 1. And they're having to hold all of those things in their mind. So you can give it to them one at a time. You can also chunk by decreasing the auditory information they're holding. So I'll often redo that with keywords on my fingers. So I might say, I can't even remember what direction I gave because I didn't hold it in my working memory. But, you know, grab your homework folder, a pencil, a clipboard, and meet me at the carpet. And then I'll say homework folder, pencil, clipboard, carpet, go. So that when they're working really hard to hold all of those steps, they have a multisensory strategy and they have less linguistic information to hold on to. So it can be breaking down multi-step directions into smaller directions, chunking the information, repeating information. I give every direction I give 2 times so that they can hold it better. And then there's a lot of visuals that you can use as a working memory strategy, because while we're speaking, our words disappear as soon as we've said them. The visuals will stay there and help them hold on to what they're supposed to be doing. So like on the bottom of this slide, we have what Carroll Spooner, who's our beginning readers teacher of our youngest students, uses. It's called an if-then chart. And what that is if students have more than one task they need to complete during a block, each student has sort of their picture on the line for that task. There's a visual reminder for what each of their 3 tasks are. As they complete each task, they go and turn over their face so that they know that it's done. They've already completed it. And then there's a then, which is like, if you're able to do all these things, then you can get out a building material, you can draw, you know, whatever the remainder activity is. So that's sort of a mechanism how you could support students to be able to hold on to all the different things they're supposed to be doing. For our older kids, like this is an example of a 5th grade graphic organizer. A great working memory strategy is to put the directions not at the top, but embedded right where they're going to be doing it. So you can see this is, I think Camille Casey, who's one of our 5th grade teachers, put her little Bitmoji in there saying like, click on the black boxes and start typing. This is where you're supposed to do the thing that you're supposed to be doing. And then the flip side of that is helping students with self-advocacy strategies. The thing about working memory is you often just need to have the self-advocacy to get what you need. So it's working a lot on normalizing self-advocacy language with students, helping them feel comfortable with saying, can you repeat that? What do you mean? I didn't understand that. Or being able to identify what they didn't understand. That's a really tricky thing for our kids, which is really important. Is if you're just having the experience of, I didn't get that, it's hard to advocate for what you need if you don't know whether you just need them to say it again. Saying it again wouldn't help because you didn't understand the words that were used. You're not sure what material they were talking about. There are all different ways that directions can run off the rails. So helping kids figure out what strategy they need and then how to get it is sort of a big piece of the self-advocacy work at the lower school.
So we continue to build off of all of those amazing strategies in the middle school. So often I work with teachers to make sure that they're using repetition and the rephrasing of the directions and expectations, because as Jen commented, sometimes we just naturally will throw in a word or a vague pronoun and the students need a little bit of support with understanding them. So making sure that we're constantly repeating and rephrasing is an excellent whole class strategy support. We also often use multi-sensory directions, so including visuals, a model, having them listen, having them read the directions, because there are sometimes differences between the visual spatial working memory capacity and then the auditory working memory capacity. And so we always want to uplift and support our students in whatever way that they are able to better recall all of these pieces of information. I also often work with students, teachers, not students, to format the assignments to reduce the working memory load, especially when they're working on Chromebooks in the middle school, because having kids needing to transition between tabs, even that small bit of a transition can just absolutely wipe information from their working memory. So making sure that they don't have to go into multiple different tabs on Classroom to access an assignment, trying to make sure that things are linked within a specific document, or it's all just within one Google Doc. So they're not needing to like go click over to the novel and read it over here and then write it down over here. Like it's all in one spot. I also work with many students on individual strategies with comprehension check-ins and guiding them to make sure they self-advocate. I support with breaking down multi-step directions and assignments. And then there is a curriculum that I work on with some students where I explicitly help them understand working memory and notice, what might be their challenges and what might be their areas of strength within working memory, which there's a fun little visual down there where it's almost the exact same Badley and Hitch cognitive model that I showed you all, but just with fun images for the kids. They like it. So some self-talk strategies that I work on with students with working memory is, what is my next step? Because oftentimes with working memory, they might have the first step where they're really good and they know exactly what they need to do, but then they lost track of the second or third step somewhere along the line. So having them pause to reflect and really think, what is my next step? What are the directions? I need to stop. I need to think back, think about my plan, and then do it. These are all language and strategies that will help to support their metacognition as they're reflecting on their ability to follow through this plan using their working memory capacity. So these are all self-talk strategies that I'm regularly saying in classrooms all around the 8th grade. So again, really quick for the sake of time, you can think about some of these working memory strategies of repeating and rephrasing, using visuals and models and self-talk in order to help your students at home. The next piece we're going to talk about is more of your traditional executive functioning cognitive strategy of organization. And Jen's going to take this one away for you here.
So I get to talk about organization, which Gwendolyn mentioned working memory is her favorite thing to talk about. Organization is mine. There are a whole bunch of different ways we can think about organization, so we're going to talk about them separately. I think organization is the biggest thing that when people think executive function, they assume we're talking about organization, and they start to think about things like, is your workspace organized or is your paper organized? But there's actually a lot that goes into organization. Big picture, we're thinking about organization as the cognitive skill that's supported by all of those other cognitive skills we've been talking about, that's supported by our executive functions and relates to overall, whether we're talking about time, materials, ideas, relates to our ability to organize and arrange things in a meaningful order. So this is my my picture of the show from the Home Edit, which is on Netflix and Instagram. I love watching the Home Edit. They are one of those people that puts everything in color-coded order and they're in little clear jars and everything has their perfect space to be in. I find it very soothing to watch everything go into its space. And I bring it up because their tagline as organizers is, they always say, like, it's a system. And I think that's the biggest thing for understanding what we mean as organization, not keeping your desk organized, but organization as an executive functioning skill, because it has to be a system that follows a logical order for it to actually help you organize. Otherwise, it's just a place where something goes. And there are a lot of skills that work together to help kids stay organized throughout their day at school and also their day at home. But the key is that if kids are going to be able to use it, it has to follow a system that makes sense, and not just makes sense to us, but makes sense to them. Otherwise, it's not accessible to them. The things that we're going to talk about in terms of breaking down organization into smaller chunks are independence with familiar routines and how that's actually an organizing strategy to organize our thinking, materials management, time management, and internally being able to organize our ideas for speaking, thinking, and writing. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is routines. Routines, I feel like, are the sleeper. They're underrated because routines help us take complex, lengthy, multi-step tasks and sequence them and then learn them in a very, very consistent manner. And it also helps students start to build those skills of sequencing, knowing what just happened, what's happening now, what's coming up next, being able to visualize that, visualize what supplies I need to do that task, and how all of those steps complete a goal. So if you think about your routine when you get into your classroom in the morning, the end goal is being ready to learn and doing your transition. And all of those steps of hanging up your backpack, taking out your homework folder, taking your coat off, all help you get there, but it's very consistent. The other thing, especially for our younger learners, is that routines are the first way we start to develop those foundational skills that build an internal sense of time. I can't tell you how often I say this to teachers or I hear from parents. It's like, I don't know why it takes them so long to do that. It's like they don't even realize that that took 25 minutes. For many of our kids, they actually don't realize it because that internal sense of how long will this take me? How long has it currently taken me? And how much do I have left to do is not yet solid. So routines that are consistent and are tied to time help us start to build that skill. The other big piece, and we got a question in the chat that we're hopefully going to have time to get to about anxiety and working memory, but this is kind of tied to that, which is that routines can really help minimize anxiety in our students, specifically our students who, whether it's due to a language-based challenge, an attention challenge, a working memory challenge, any of these things we're talking about, are struggling to visualize multi-step directions. That can feel really anxiety-inducing to our students. When they have a learned, practiced routine that they know backwards and forwards, it can take that anxiety away. There are a lot of confounding factors that can make things tricky for our kids during the day, and a consistent, predictable routine can help to take away confounding variables like attention. Did they attend to the 7-step direction you just gave them about getting ready for their school day? Anxiety, could they hold it in their working memory? They don't have to because it's an internalized routine. So routines can help really minimize this anxiety in our students. We have on the right of this slide some common routines that we do at school that we do it the same way every time because the routine helps. The ones that are bolded are the routines that would also translate really well to being a consistent routine at home. As I've been saying, here's the thing with routines. They help us visualize so that we know what's already happened and what's coming next. They help us visualize what's already happened, what's happening right now, and what I need to do next and what's going to happen next. We also wanted to put in this piece about where routines come up in conversation. And this is where we sort of hit on some of that social pragmatics piece. We have a little comic on here about small talk, because small talk is a conversational routine. And what that does is it helps us predict how we're going to interact with other people, when we're going to interact with other people, and what we can expect from interacting with them in those predictable scenarios. So when you first transition into a class and you say, hey, Mrs. Amos, you have some kind of a routine in your head about how that's most likely to go. So it helps us participate in those sort of social niceties during the day. But the other piece that's really interesting about it is that it helps you notice when something doesn't follow the routine. So if you're expecting a conversation to go a certain way and the tone is unexpected, the facial expression you're seeing is unexpected, someone doesn't respond or responds in a different way than you're expecting, you can start to clue into that, like, that was unexpected. What's going on? Are they upset with me? Did I forget something? Am I not here at the right time? You can start to build that self-talk of, this isn't following my routine. Why? What are the possibilities? Which can be really interesting. In terms of routines at the lower school, we talk a lot about routines at the lower school. It's a responsive classroom protocol. We call the first 6 weeks of the school year routine setting weeks. And then we call like the next 3-ish weeks when we get back from December break and we've forgotten all of our routines, routine setting part 2. And the reason we do that is it helps our kids know what to expect before we start asking them to do really hard things. It builds trust, it builds predictability, it decreases anxiety, and helps kids feel like they're confident participants in their day before we then start to change things up and challenge them. The biggest ways we can support students at the lower school with routines is making them visual. That supports the working memory piece of they can, they don't have to hold it auditorily. But also then students can independently track their progress through the routine. They can reference it as many times as they need to. This is one of our beginning readers or second grade classrooms, this blue pocket chart schedule, that it's a visual schedule. There's words, there's images, but then you can see some of it is sort of aligned to the right and some of it's aligned to the day, that it's somebody's job throughout the day when they finish a class to slide a completed class over to the right so that you can track where you are in your day. Then that can look like you have a visual daily schedule. And then as we get older, the fifth graders start each of their classes with a consistent transition in schedule and a slide that's the agenda for the day, so that even within a class period, there's a consistent routine for fifth graders that they always start with their homework routine. Then they do some deep breathing to transition in. They do some kind of major activity, and then there's an exit ticket out. And even within that class block, it's predictable for them. And then the only other place I'm going to talk about where this comes in at the lower school is that we use responsive classroom as our social emotional curriculum. So in the morning, we have morning meeting, which is how every student transitions into their day. And that also follows a very prescribed routine that helps build community within the classroom in the context of a routine-based setting. It's very similar to like the classic circle time model, where students transition in and there's always a greeting, there is always a share, there's always an activity, and you always complete a morning message. It's the same way every day.
So we definitely build on all of these standard routines in the middle school. As there's so much change throughout the day, as they're transitioning from room to room, having specific routines is so essential to help the kids know what class are they going to now? What class is next? What should I be doing when I enter this classroom? So within the class, similar to the fifth grade classrooms, we always have do now transition routines where, depending on the grade, they might all have to write down their homework at that exact time. The teacher might check it, and then they can do a do now activity, or it might be that the homework's posted on the board in eighth grade and they're expected to independently copy and paste it or write it down into their homework planner. And then they have a do now transition that they're all completing, checking their do now work, and then they're reviewing their agenda for the day. So it's important to make sure that it's the daily routine and even the individual class routine is clearly written out with expectations. So that way the kids can orient themselves within the time. They can predict how much time is left in class and make sure that they are aware of where they should be throughout that day. Some individual strategies for kids who might need a little bit of additional support is visual preview of daily schedules, especially for unusual routine days like fall festival or parent visitor day. If we had some of you on campus, it's very helpful for kids on those like unusual routine days to have an explicit time where they preview exactly what they'll be doing and where they're expected to go. And then oftentimes I might print out an individual schedule card for students. I think I have a copy right down there with that middle school schedule, and students can reflect on that one. Another piece is in the upper school, they actually have that daily schedule and routine built into their planner. So they're always going to go through and double check their routines and whenever they're looking at their homework planner. So it's just a helpful strategy for them. And then we also have some self-talk strategies for routines. So one that I love is what is happening now? What is happening next? I hear that so often, even just like walking through the hallways now in the middle school, kids are like, wait, what's happening next? And it's just that self-talk language as they try to orient themselves to the routine of like, I was just in math class, next I'm going to history class. And that's with that, what did I just do self-talk, reminding themselves to orient themselves and think, where was I last? What can I expect next? Or where am I? What time is it? So that way they're able to predict what they should be doing based on that routine. So they can begin to organize their time and their activities based on their predictable daily routines.
Sorry, couldn't find the mute again. Got lost in my own screen. So then the next piece in terms of organization is managing your materials. I think this is where we typically think of when we say if a kid is organized or disorganized, we're often talking about their ability to manage materials. The reason we tend to focus on this is because if students aren't effectively managing their materials, then they aren't ready to learn, because the cognitive load of being able to initiate the task they have to do is too high if they don't know what materials they need. And then once they figure out what materials they need, they don't know where to get them. I'm going to emphasize again on this, that this system has to be logical. For students to be able to use this kind of system, it has to make sense to them, because it has to make sense where to put it away. But also, if they can't remember all of the pieces of their system and they think to themselves, where would I find scissors in this classroom? If it's in an arbitrary place, they can't use their logical reasoning to figure out and deduce how it's set up. One piece that's sort of just an important aside when we think about the middle school and the upper school, that given how education is trending for our older students, when we talk about managing materials, a lot of that organization and managing their materials is actually digital materials and managing documents and classes and knowing where they've stored things within a system like Google Classroom. In terms of what that can look like at the lower school, it's going to developmentally vary as kids get older. So everything has a logical place, but what's logical changes based on the developmental appropriateness for that age kid. So if we look at something like the binders that might go home from school, when you're looking at a student who's a first or second grader, the way they organize is I went to school today and when was the weekend and when is the next weekend coming? So we're not going to break things down by class. Their binder is going to look like their Monday work, their Tuesday work, their Wednesday work, their Thursday work. And then when we look at something like third grade, it might start to be broken down into, I have homework or a section for my math class, and I have a different section where I would find things for my language class, and we're going to organize by content area. And then that might move into towards fifth grade, things might be organized within a specific activity. So when they log into Google Classroom and they have all of the assignments they need to complete to write an essay, that there's a section that's for homework, a section where they can find the things for their essay and their graphic organizer, and that they're now organizing even within a class, within a project. And then the other piece too, is that we provide a lot of visual supports to also organize the information we're learning about our peers. One thing we do with the lower schoolers is we talk about brain files as the location in your head where you're storing information that you know about somebody else, because that's how you show them that you care about them. So mirroring those systems internally can help support our ability to then have those internal systems.
All right, so this is very important in the middle school, and I do just want to note, we did not manage our time as well in our executive functioning talk. So we're going to be going on for like 15 more minutes, and then we will let you go, I promise. But thank you for your patience. So as Jen sort of mentioned, it looks like in the middle school, oftentimes we are working on Google Drive, how to create a folder, how to name topics for our documents appropriately and sort them within those folders. I do just want to point out, this is where categorization and semantic features are being able to link items based on like their purpose and function and what they do and their shared properties is so important for executive functioning, because that is a linguistic ability to be able to sort through these things. So for many of our students, we give them these binders and divider tabs, and they're using their categorization linguistic skills to sort things within them. So we also have regular binder, email, and Google Drive checks for our students. And we have individual strategies and check-ins for gathering materials and preparing for assignments. We might even have, for some students, a missed assignment tracker. For example, if they were on vacation, off skiing somewhere for a week, and they missed a large number of assignments. That can be really challenging for our students to go back within Google Classroom and find past history assignments and past math assignments. So we have one central place to help them organize and track all of those digital files. So one other whole class Google Drive strategy is creating one specific spot on Google Classroom. They'll be able to find all of the information that they need for that day within today's work topic. So some common self-talk strategies is thinking about, where should I put this? What should my finished product look like? If they're trying to organize materials, maybe within their binder or within some 8th graders just made these fabulous heart diagram posters. So if they're trying to organize the materials on the posters, Thinking about what is my job right now? What do I need? Making sure that before they leave that day, they have all of the materials they need that night for homework. So these are all self-talk strategies that are building that metacognition. And speaking of time.
All right, so then the next sort of piece is managing time, which is a tricky one for a lot of our kids because before you can manage your time, you have to actually have an internal sense of time. And like I was mentioning, for some of our kids, that's not solid yet. When we're thinking about time management, there's a couple different pieces that can go into things we would call time management, but really it's monitoring and managing time as it passes. So that can include estimating how long something will take, being able to chunk a task and say like, okay, I have 30 minutes to work on this today. So this is the piece I can accomplish in 30 minutes. That's what I'll tackle. Prioritizing and then sequencing tasks based on when it's due, not based on what I feel like doing in this moment. Understanding the difference in timeframes between what's happening right now, what's happening today, what's happening this week, what's happening this month, and then understanding how to share time and space with others. At the lower school, because many of our kids are really still working on telling time and their sense of time, the best thing we can do for kids is making the passage of time visual for them. This thing that looks kind of like a clock going backwards is called a time timer. It is one of my favorite tools. It's like $12, and I think it's like the best thing you can have because the time ticks down visually. So for our kids who we say, you have 10 minutes to work, and they don't know if that means I can write one more word or this is going to last forever, they can actually see the color decreasing. They can see like, oh, I don't know how much time I have, but I used to have this big time and now I have this big time left. And so that helps them know what's going on. Those visual schedules, like we were talking about with routines, is really helpful to help them understand, like we've been talking about, what just happened, what's already complete, what's happening right now, and what's coming next. That can also have a huge impact on that anxiety piece. And then the other thing we tend to look at more so as we move into the older lower school grades is things called time robbers. So when kids are like, I don't know what happened. I ran out of time. I couldn't possibly have gotten my 10 minutes of reading done last night because of hockey practice, which lasted an hour and you were home for 5. We can start to look at, we often use the phrase time robbers, which is, can you identify where your time went and build that awareness to then know, okay, so how could I do this differently next time? Let's set a goal. How could I approach it differently?
So we also talk about time robbers in the middle and upper school. There tends to be quite a few electronic time robbers that my middle schoolers often report. So one thing that we do for some whole class strategies is we make sure that our homework is designed to be completed within specific timeframes. So we often recommend that students will set a timer, and it's not like, oh, the timer's done, I immediately am finished no matter where I am. But it's a really good way to sort of track your own time and gauge, is this something that I'm only halfway through and I should maybe send an email to my teacher to double check and check in with them in morning meeting? Or is this something where I only have 1 or 2 problems left that I could quickly finish? We often use timers for individual work time to help students understand and estimate how much time they have left. And whenever there's a long-term project, I always work with teachers to create suggestive timelines within the 8th grade. So some individual strategies that I might use more specifically with students could be a night at a glance, where during NCLU, which is that like end of the time homeroom period where they check in with their advisor, the advisor I could work on literally scheduling out everything they're doing that night between hockey practice and dinner and their like 8:30 p.m. hockey practice that many of my students go to, where they're scheduling out when and how they'll be completing their homework assignments and estimating how long the homework assignments will take. We also have some time management flex curriculum where students begin to take a look at their whole day and map it out, which you've seen that sort of 24-hour fraction circle down there where they've colored out exactly how they spend their time in the day. And then in the upper school, there's again that daily planner where they work in that study hall time to actually map out what they're going to be doing every single night. And when you're thinking about self-talk in time, really, what time is it? That's a phrase many of our students know and are familiar with and are always asking. But it's like, what is my job right now? We can think, how long is this going to take? What are the steps I need to accomplish? And again, how long will this take? My plans have steps. What are my steps and what should I be doing? So this is the example of how we can begin to, again, use that metacognition to organize that self-talk.
And then that all builds to kind of those foundational skills, help us do the most complex task, which is organizing ideas and organizing our thinking. What's really interesting about it is it's the same categorical logical reasoning that we use to organize our thinking that we've used to organize our time and organize our materials. So practice with those pieces can build to help us use the same types of systems in our thinking. The reason we talk about this a lot as speech language pathologists is that organizing our thinking in a logical way is a foundational skill to being able to communicate our thoughts and ideas to other people. If I can't tell you what I'm thinking in a way that's clear, concise, and will make sense to someone else, then I'm not going to be seen and heard by other people. So really, this is a key student skill, and it's also a key piece of your self-concept and your identity. So this is our fun slide, which has a rhetorical question. When do we need to systematically organize our thinking? The answer is all the time. Anytime we're sequencing steps, we're planning, we're visualizing, we're making an argument, we're keeping track of time, we're telling a story about what happened over the weekend, we're understanding the relationship between categories. Any of those things require us to organize our thinking in a logical, systematic way so that we can communicate it in a way that makes sense and access it later. There are a lot of supports to organize thinking at the lower school. This is, I would say, the core of what we're working on a lot in language class. The biggest thing that we work on at the lower school level is making those connections and sequences visible to students so that they understand there's an implied connection, even though it's happening in their heads and they can't see it. So that's using things like the story form plot so they can understand the arc of a story in a visual way. Things like these WH question webs, where they can see that those are all connected to the topic that they're working on. Something like a get ready, do done helps you understand that the materials you use and the steps you take to complete a task actually are related to the end product that you end up with. And then understand how time management relates to all of that planning and sequencing of the ideas. It gets more complicated as you get into the older, lower grades, where it can be things like understanding what your graphic organizer is for, and if your graphic organizer is actually connected to the essay you're going to write later, if it was two different assignments, and how that's helping you organize your thinking. And then the last piece is that I actually use this graphic organizer type system a lot to help kids organize their social thinking around things that have happened to them. A lot of times when kids are upset, they will come to you and try to tell you what happened out at recess, and they start at the end, and you're like, I know you're really upset, and I don't understand what happened to know how to help you. So I find that often even just drawing out little stick figures, some kind of a storyboard to help them organize the sequencing of like, oh, and then you did this, and then they'll say, no, before that, I actually did this. And you can say, oh, okay, and help sequence it for them, can help them make sense of what just happened to them to get what they need.
That's another amazing example why language and executive functions are so important and intricately related, because in the middle school, kids are often talking to their friends about what they did this weekend or what they want to do, and being able to organize and sequence all of those ideas into a meaningful narrative is so important. So this is massive within the middle school, especially within the writing curriculum and math curriculum. So some whole class strategies that we do is brainstorming and organizing our ideas as a class, depending on the class. We do explicit teaching of graphic organizers in order to build logical arguments. In the middle school, we often use a CER organizer, or a claim, back it up with evidence, and explain your evidence with reasoning. And so the kids learn how to write paragraphs within that logical order to answer questions. Then, whenever we're doing comprehension work, they often are learning a similar plot element structure, but as you can see right above that CER graphic organizer, that it's more developmentally appropriate for the middle schoolers, making sure that they're tracking all the elements of a narrative. Additionally, we use split page notes where they're tracking the main idea and organizing key details associated with that main idea, which we often do in history and science classes. Some things that we do in math classes is we use breakdown grids, especially for complex organizational tasks like substitution and systems of equations, or how do we add mixed numbers and fractions, where there's so many steps. And sometimes our kids can get lost in the middle where they're jumping from step 1 to just step 3 or 4. And so having a breakdown grid, which is almost a graphic organizer for these complex math tasks, is extremely helpful. Some other strategies is I might check in with students for graphic organizer support during NCLU, or organization in math curriculum is an additional strategy I use for my kids. So some self-talk strategies for if they're writing or reading, thinking about the main idea. What does the reader or listener need to know to help them identify what is the most important salient piece of information here? What is my goal, which we're actually going to quickly talk about next, is so essential for when they're completing and organizing that task, because their goal will often think about how they will be organizing this information in their writing. And does this topic have parts or an order is also so essential for our students to be thinking about. So for the sake of time, we are going to super fast zoom through goals. So goal management is like, if we think of all of the executive functioning skills building up, goal management is towards the top. As you saw way back when in that executive functioning development graph, goal management is something that my middle schoolers are just beginning to work on more independently. So it's an essential executive function that is so important for many of our students to be able to break down goals into achievable parts. So a quick overview is that there's a number of essential cognitive skills that need to be able to identify an achievable long-term goal. It's not just like be a rock star for every single achievable long-term goal. They need to be able to break it down and identify incremental short-term goals that build off of each other. Next, they need to be able to process feedback and adjust their behavior based on their goal. So again, this is getting more and more complex. They need to self-monitor their behavior to compare it to their goal to see, is my behavior actually matching the goal that I have for this moment? So it is a very challenging task for them to work through. Another important piece I just want to quickly touch on, we could spend an entire talk talking about this, but initiation is the ability to independently start a task and turn that thought into behavior. So it's unfortunately not that we just have the plan and then we immediately do it. They actually have to start the plan, which does require that separate executive functioning of task initiation, which is something that I'm actually currently working on students with.
In terms of the lower school, just developmentally where our students are at, a lot of the goal setting is really adult driven. So it's collaborative with students to come up with realistic goals, but it's the adults who are doing the back and forth conversation with them about like, is that a goal that makes sense to be a goal we can achieve this year? You know, we're working on sequencing the alphabet and tutoring, and your goal was to read all 7 Harry Potter books by yourself this year. Like, let's talk about where we should go with that. We do something in every grade at the lower school called Hopes and Dreams, which they will periodically update, which is just sort of what are they hoping will happen? And so the teacher is helping them both set a goal that's reasonable, monitor how they're doing in that goal, making their progress towards that goal visible to them, and then helping them assess and modify their goal if needed. This is a read naturally chart. But again, it's just another way that once we've set the goal, which in that case would be to improve reading fluency, that we're making progress toward that goal visible to our students, because they don't always feel it internally if they're getting closer until they can see it.
So a big part of the middle school and upper school support is whole class strategies on daily goals on the upper school planners. We also work on structured SMART goal setting within the middle school to help break down the goal setting process for our students. We often have whole class goal reflections where at the end or beginning of each trimester, students will reflect on how they have done so far and then select a goal for how they would like to do for the next trimester. Then for some individual strategies, we might do get ready, do done, where they have individual goals within a certain time period. They have support with structured goal setting at NCLU, and then there's a goal setting curriculum that I sometimes work on with specific students. Another thing, I love working on this goal, plan, predict, do. This is like all of the executive functions within one self-talk strategy to help remind them as they have a specific goal, they make their plan, they need to predict what will happen and then do it for that task initiation. Another piece is being able to change your behavior based on the feedback of what's happening around you. So thinking, this isn't working, how can I do this another way? And then just reminding them, what is my goal? Do I need help getting started? This is one that we often find students with task initiation wanting to remind themselves of, what is my goal? How do I get started on this task? So just to wrap everything up, to spiral back, we do use language to organize and plan our executive functioning. Some key parts that we use is the syntax. If we're thinking about the grammar, conjunctions, using language, conditional phrases like if, then, and however are very important for our understanding of directions and making plans, or sequential markers like after, before, first, second, next, to help students really understand these goals that they're making. For our semantic features, they are so essential for that organization piece, as I mentioned. Descriptions of objects, making sure that similar objects are near each other. That closet, everything was organized by color and was beautiful. But another person might organize it in a way that makes sense to their brain, maybe based on the location where they need to use the object, the use, the action, the group the object is within. And finally, very importantly, is the verbs, because all of executive functioning is about doing things with our goals. And so those action steps are so essential. Noticing the difference between a direction of like choose, assess, contrast, estimate, sketch. So these are the abilities of how we use language to just self-talk and regulate ourselves through the goals in our own inner dialogues. So again, our soapbox reminder, language does have that bi-directional relationship to attention, working memory, organization, and goal setting and planning. Throughout our conversations, throughout our ability to follow directions or then being supported, explaining and thinking of words and writing. There we are. Understanding of what we hear in stories we read. These are all language skills that are being connected and supported by attention and working memory. And as we've been kind of alluding to, just connecting with other people and being able to share stories and conversations are all supported by our executive functions. So it's that bi-directional developmental relationship, which is why we here as SLPs are talking to you about language and executive functioning at Carroll. So if you have any questions and we don't get to you, you can always email us later, but I'm going to pass this off to the fabulous Stacey Daniels for the night.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jen and Gwendolyn, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone in the audience. It was really, really informative. I learn from you both every single time I hear you present. In the interest of time, I think we're going to take questions offline and we'll be emailing folks. Thank you so much for them. And we promise to get back to you real soon. So have a wonderful evening and happy almost weekend. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. Take care.